Start the notes on B7E. And so remember, if you need to pause this video, do it so you can catch up with the notes here. So B7E, take a minute and set up your paper. And the teak we're doing again is B7E. And so what you're going to do is analyze, ladies, and evaluate. You've had those two over and over and over again. Analyze and evaluate. Check for patterns, look for patterns in stuff that you're doing, and then how valid is it? How true is it? How useful is it here? So we analyze and evaluate. What are we going to analyze and evaluate this time? We're going to analyze and evaluate the relationship of natural selection to two things. One, how is natural selection related to adaptation? Which we've been talking about and incorporating these into the notes that we've already taken. And two, how is the relationship of natural selection to the development of diversity in and among species? Okay, here's the big word, diversity. That's the one you're looking at. How is natural selection related to the development of diversity in and among species? So within a species, how is natural selection dealing with it? How does it create diversity? And between species, how does it create diversity here? And the first thing I'm going to write under here is the whole phrase natural selection in the notes, because what you need to make sure that you do is you turn back 2 pages, because the last 2 pages of notes are all about natural selection. The next thing I'm going to write on here is adaptation, because this is what it's all about. So it's linking natural selection to adaptation and natural selection to diversity. Those are the 2 phrases that it's linking here. And what I'm going to write out here beside this is B12B, and that's Unit 3. So you write that down, because we're not going to take the notes all over adaptation again. All you have to do is turn back to Unit 3 in your spiral. So you've got your spiral marked off. Turn back to Unit 3 right here. And the very first page of notes in Unit 3, there's B12B, and it's adaptations. So we talked about adaptations. Do you guys want to write all this over again? There's no purpose in it, right? You have it right here. You write it in your notes, B12B. It's the first page of Unit 3, and you can go back here. We talked about adaptations in the form of metabolic adaptations, where whether or not you're warm-blooded, cold-blooded, whether you're heterotrophs, autotrophs, how do you get your food, antibiotic resistance, things like that. We talked about anatomical adaptations, the body shape and things like that. And then we also talked about behavioral adaptations, like, are some active during the day, are some active at night, what are their mating rituals, things like that. So all you have to do is go back to that page, and then you've got the notes there. So it's your responsibility. The adaptations will be on the next test. You need to be aware of that. So adaptations, again, are traits or characteristics. Do you guys know traits and characteristics are the same thing? If you don't know that traits and characteristics are the same thing, write characteristics in parentheses beside that. So traits are another word for characteristics. Traits and organism, so adaptations are traits an organism is born with. And they increase the organism's chances for survival in its environment. There's no reason to have the trait if they don't increase the chances of survival in its environment. What that means to us is that it increases the fitness of the animal or the plant or whatever it is. And remember that fitness, when we talk about that word fitness, it's not just surviving, it's also about reproductive success. So again, don't get caught on that word fitness and think going to the gym. That's not enough. It's not just surviving. It's not just being strong. It's that reproductive success. When these adaptations are passed on, what you have is an increase in gene frequency. Okay, so again, I'm popping in vocabulary terms so you get accustomed to these. When you pass those traits on, they're going to show up more and more and more often, so that means it's an increase in gene frequency. Those traits make them better successful in their environment. That's why all tigers look pretty much alike, don't they? There's some minor variations, but when we look at it, we know what it's going to look like. We know it's a basic, this is what they're going to look like. They're all going to be orange and black stripes, right? And if we don't really study them, we're going to have difficulty telling them apart. We know what orcas look like. Yeah, killer whales. Can you tell them, if I line 10 of them up, can you tell them all apart? Probably not. You could study them for a while and maybe there are some variations, but what they have in their environment is that coloring, everything they have is suited to that, makes them best suited. So those traits, that coloring that they have is most best suited to the environment, so it shows up again and again and again. Now look at humans. We humans are pretty much, I mean, we've in many cases, we've kind of taken ourselves out of the evolution because we modify our environment. No other organism on the planet adapts to its environment except us. That, what I just said earlier, you walk out in the morning and it's cold, you walk back inside and get a coat. You just adapted to your environment. Animals don't do that. Plants don't do that. They are born with a set of variations, of adaptations, and that's what they have to deal with. We humans have the brain. That's our biggest adaptation is the brain, and so we can modify things. So in many cases, we can't look at humans. I mean, if you look at humans, don't we all look different? I mean, we have the basic 2 arms, 2 legs, that's, head, the organs that are inside, that's about it. But nothing like if you look at lions or tigers, all the tigers pretty much look alike, all the lions pretty much look alike. You don't have that with humans because we've kind of taken a step outside of the evolutionary process and we modify it. So whenever we talk about this evolutionary theory and all this natural selection and stuff like that, don't use human as your example. Use other animals as your examples. That's going to be where we can best see this stuff. Don't fall into that trap of thinking, well, humans can do this. Yeah, we're the only ones that can. No other organisms can do what the human animal can do. Okay, so pick another color. And let's talk about next natural selection. Because we have to talk about natural selection as it increases diversity and as it has to do with adaptation. Now, I can tell you right here, natural selection, here's the key here. Whenever these whichever adaptations make them more fit, those are the ones that are going to be passed on. Those are the ones that are going to be selected by nature to be passed on. So this is really that link between natural selection and adaptation. Whichever adaptations work best for them, increase the fitness, those are going to be passed on. Now we can look at natural selection and we can look about diversity within a species and between species. Okay? So natural selection increases diversity within and among, but we'll get to that in a minute. Within a species by creating organisms that are uniquely adapted to their environment. Even though I said that, hey, pretty much all the tigers look alike, they are still unique to each other. They are, if we got around them and we studied them and we worked with them or whatever, we would be able to find the variations within there. They might not have as many variations as humans do, but again, don't look at humans as the example. Look at the other organisms, and you're going to find that there are variations within that. If there were not variations, if there's a disease that kills off one of the tigers, they can't fight it off, then it's going to kill them all off. And you find that that's not the case. Do tigers suffer from diseases? Yeah. They suffer from bacterial diseases, they suffer from viral diseases, just like any other organism, and they're all still here. There's a good, healthy population of them, so that means that they're not all alike. Some of them are susceptible to it, some of them aren't. Those that are uniquely susceptible to their environment, those that are better adapted to that environment, that constantly changing environment with viruses and bacteria and stuff, are going to be the ones that more likely survive.
Did you consider dogs like a part of that? Because there's so many different variants of dogs.
The problem with dogs is we are no longer natural. That's not a natural selection. Dogs are totally and completely artificially selected. Unless you talk about mutts that escape and run loose, still we humans have naturally selected for those characteristics. There would be no dogs except for humans jumping in and saying, yeah, this is what they are. There would be wolves, there would be predecessors to that, there would be coyotes, there would be no dogs. Yeah? U-N-I-Q-U-E-L. Did I not spell it? I-N-U-N-I-Q-U-E. I left something out? Uniquely. Yeah. Nope, that's right. U-N-I-Q-U-E-L-Y. Yes. So, yeah, you can't take any of our domesticated organisms and talk about them because it's not natural selection. It's artificial selection is what we've done here. So the key here is these things are going to be very uniquely adapted to their environment, and they're adapted to very, very specific environments. They have a niche or a niche, whichever way you want to say it. A niche, and a niche is like their role or their job in the community. Okay, so what do I mean by the niche there? So let's say a ground squirrel. It has a job and it has a role. It's going to burrow into little burrows in the ground. It's going to eat seeds. It's going to live in an area that's pretty flat. It's going to live in an area that doesn't have really tall grasses or anything like that. That's its niche. If we talk about a human, if we talk about you have a niche. You have to spend part of your time at the school building, part of your time at your house. You are a brother or a sister or a daughter or a son. You have friends that you're associated with. You eat certain things at McDonald's or whatever. You have a job. What is your job in your environment? So each organism has its own environment. They can even be within the same environments, and you still have different organisms that are adapted differently to that. Like if you get a pond system, like a freshwater system, they're going to be frogs, yeah? They're going to be fish, they're going to be bugs. All sorts of them are in that freshwater pond area, but they don't all do the exact same thing. The frog is going to be in there living in the mud, in the sludge there, and it's going to feed on small fish. It'll feed on insects. Then you have let's say there's a catfish in there. It's going to be living in a different area, probably deeper down, and it's going to feed on the frogs. It could be on insects and stuff like too. They occupy a little different. They have a little bit different niche. They're slightly different from each other, and those niches all fit together like puzzle pieces, right? Yeah? If one puzzle piece is taken out, the picture's incomplete. It destabilizes things. If we put an invasive species in there, doesn't it also destabilize things? Messes with everybody's niche that are in there. So we have natural selection and diversity within the species. So even the frogs that are in there, they have slightly different variations that are going to allow them to enable it to survive better. The next one, I'm going to pick another color here. Let's pick purple. The next one will be another natural selection, but in this case we're going to talk about among species. Yeah. There you go. Here when we have natural selection, we're talking about creating new species over time. And remember, it's got to be a lot of time. What do we call that? What's the definition? Creating new species, what do we call that? What's the word for that? Think smaller. Starts with an SP. Speciation. Creating new species is called speciation. So when we talk about this, there are two main ways that natural selection can really be used to help create new species. And the first is when you have geographical isolation, which is exactly what it sounds like. What this means is a population gets separated from reproducing with their own, these organisms, let's say it this way. The organisms get separated from reproducing with the part of their population. So there's some type of barrier that's come up. Maybe there's an earthquake and the river changes its course. And so now you've got a river that's separating where there wasn't one before. Maybe there's a cliff that forms. Maybe there's an ice bridge that over time goes away. So you had them where they could pass back and forth along the bridge, but now it's gone. But you've got some kind of barrier that separates them. It's the geography. If they're large animals, it's going to be a larger barrier. Maybe it's a mountain range. If they're smaller animals, it could be just a small thing that happens. Maybe it's a parking lot. A parking lot separates the two of them. But where you had one population, now instead there's some kind of barrier so they can't get to each other and mate. So now there's some type of geographical barrier between them and they can't get to each other to mate and have offspring. What that means is now that you've got them separated, different types of variations can occur in each group. There we go. So again, you've got some kind of separation. We can look today and we can see that there are some animals that are in the process of evolution, that you can see things happening. Like in the U.S., we have cougars on the western side of the U.S. and we have cougars on the eastern side, especially southeastern. And for the longest time, they thought they were different species. The southeast cougars are pretty small compared to the ones in the Rocky Mountains. And they thought, oh, well, yeah, they're just different species. But with the event of really looking at genetics, they realized they're the same species. But there's a barrier. They've got this huge, vast plains area where there's now a barrier where they don't cross. They tend to stay in the trees and area. If you look at them, the ones in the southeastern U.S., they're mostly fishers. They fish. That's what they get most of their food. They're in swampy areas. They're going to fish. They're going to get their food that way. If you look at the ones in the Rockies, they're not like that. They're not going to eat stuff like that. And so they've started in the process of evolving. Right now, if we put them back together, they would form that one species again. But you can see as time goes by, they're just starting down that path of that geographical barrier, geographical isolation, so they're starting two different species over there. Yeah? Okay. Let me show you one that's gone way farther down the path. Think about a lion and a tiger. We talked about this before, right, in this class? The ligers, yes? Was it this class?
Yes.
Yeah. So you know that they can mate and have offspring. And the ligers can actually mate and have offspring, although they're not the most viable. They still technically they can mate and have offspring themselves, so technically they're still there. The problem is that we no longer have these organisms that are that closely related anymore. If we put them out in the wild together, they're not going to mate and have offspring, right? They're much farther down the path. But if we look genetically, if we get cubs of each, we know that they can mate and have offspring, right? So we know that's a possibility. But right now, we have geographical isolation because, well, the lions are going to be in the savanna, right? The plains. And where are the tigers? Yeah, they're in the jungles. I don't know why the lion is called the king of the jungle, because he doesn't live in the jungle, does he? I don't know. You throw a lion in the jungle and the tiger's going to kill him. So, but anyway, you have that geographical isolation. The other way of doing this and looking at a new type of species that's being formed is through behavioral isolation. It could be when they're active. Like some are nocturnal and some are diurnal. Nocturnal, they're active at night. Diurnal, they're active during the day. It could be that there are some species of spiders, in when they're mating, they're doing their little mating call. What they do is they tap out a certain pattern on their web, and that's how the female knows that they're ready to mate. If they don't tap the right pattern, the female's not going to come there. So if you have them separated for a while, then the pattern changes. Even if they get back together, they could still possibly mate and have offspring, but the pattern changes. So now they don't recognize each other anymore. And so you have also that, not just you put them back together so there's no longer a geographical isolation, but now you've got a behavioral isolation pattern. This is when they start out being capable of interbreeding. But they don't. Due to something. It could be courtship behavior. Like with the spiders, they don't recognize the right pattern. It could be when they're active. You know, technically, whitetail and mule deer can mate and have offspring, but they're not always active at the same time. Mule deer tend to be more active during the day. Whitetail tend to be more skittish, and they're more active at the dawn and dusk. So they're not active at quite the same times. So it limits their contact with each other. It could be what they eat. Now, I don't mean comparing carnivores to herbivores, but it could be some of them they're herbivores, but some of them you'll find more so, like the mule deer, you'll find them grazing with the cattle. You won't ever find whitetail, or very seldom will you find whitetail grazing with the cattle. Yeah. Yeah, sometimes you'll find some, especially if you have grains out there with them, but the vast majority of the times you won't find them grazing out with the cattle. But again, and it's not that they can't mate and have offspring, although the offspring still are a little iffy, but they're sometimes, just by their very behavior, they don't come into contact with each other that way. So that's what we're talking about with behavioral isolation. And again, you can look at examples like, even if you look at the tiger and the lion, if I can spell lion, we have the geographical, obviously, so they are geographically isolated with each other, but they also are behavioral. Yeah, sorry, keep losing this. Because think about how they hunt. So you've got this baby lion and baby tiger, and you've raised them together until they mate and have offspring. Are they going to be stalkers where they're kind of in the trees and they're going to jump down on their predator like in the jungle? Or are they going to be out in the savannah where they still stalk, but they're really going to chase down the organism, right? You guys have seen all the African videos of the lions and stuff. Two different types of hunting. So when you do have something that you've artificially kind of forced them into doing this, how viable is the offspring? It might be able to mate and have offspring, but is it going to be able to survive out in the wild? You know, someone said, well, could we just try that? You know, we'll get 20 of these ligers and set them free. It's like, oh, invasive species, yeah? Because they're typically bigger than the lions even, and bigger than the tigers even. So then you have issues with that. So it's not something that we're going to find happening. We're not going to, we're not going to create an island for ligers and let's just see what happens. I don't think that's going to be the way we go. And just see what happens. But man, they would take over no matter where we put them. If we put them in the Rockies, no more bears, no more moose, because I would think they'd take over if they were healthy enough to survive. But yeah, so you get some weird stuff. And the last thing I want to put on here is just another thing on artificial selection. And you guys should already know what this is. I'm going to tell you that you might also see this on the STAR test as selective breeding. Don't let that phrase throw you off. Selective, we select what the traits are. So selective breeding is in there too. You must have human intervention for this. This is the only thing. Someone asked me earlier about what would you call it if you had aliens? That would be called no scientific evidence. Yeah. So you've got to have human intervention with this. These are our domesticated animals, pets, cattle, and it's not just animals. Think plants, our crops. We really work on our crops and make sure that we get the biggest amount of grain for our money. I mean, when you get seeds, if you want to grow tomatoes in your backyard, you're going to get seeds that are, if you look at the packages, they purposely get those tomato plants that make the biggest tomatoes, they make the sweetest ones, so they taste a certain way. So there are, even the seeds that we make, we selectively breed those. Hang on, is it Bushland? There's an ag farm out close to Bushland. I can't remember what its name is. It's a Texas Tech or UT. It's a ag lab station, basically. I can't remember what it's called. Anyway, they test plant seeds. They test different hybrids, different artificially selected plants and stuff to breed, so we can get better stuff here going on too. Okay, so this is the last part of the notes here. We have one more we'll take tomorrow, and we'll do B7F, and then we'll be finished with the notes, but we won't take the test over this stuff until after you get back from Christmas. When you get back from the Christmas break,